Hey, what's up everybody? This is Osterberg501 and today I want to go over the massive amount of popularity and success that New World was able to achieve in the first week of its closed beta, and I also want to go over my general opinions on the game. And just a side note, I have been posting guides and other videos similar to that for New World on my MMO focused channel, so that will be linked in the description. Go subscribe there if you want to see videos on New World, Ash of Creation, Corepunk, or any other MMOs. I want that channel to be completely focused on MMO news, MMO guides, stuff like that, that's going to be more focused on the genre. And this main channel is mainly just focused on whatever I feel like making videos on and whatever game I'm grinding at that point in time. Now, New World is an upcoming open world MMORPG that is being developed by Amazon Studios, and they recently released their closed beta test, which will be running from July 20th until August 2nd, and then the game will be fully released on August 31st. Just in this closed beta, the game was able to accomplish some pretty ridiculous player counts and Twitch viewer counts. They were able to get up to a little over 190,000 concurrent players on Steam and over 700,000 unique viewers on Twitch, which is absolutely ridiculous and quite a bit more popular than I thought the game would be, even right at the start of its life. Those are pretty big numbers, and the numbers have held pretty well, at least on the Steam side, and I think the 24-hour peak for today was sitting at over 150,000 concurrent players, so that's not a fluke that just happened the first day. It's currently the 25th of July, so 5 days later, and it's still able to keep a vast majority of those players playing in even a beta that everybody knows is going to be wiped in a week. So things are at least boding well for players' interest in the game, at least the start of the game. And I wanted to give some of my overall thoughts on the game. Now, I don't want to go super in depth. I just want to give an overview of my thoughts on the game. And the first thing is that New World does legitimately feel like an MMO, which is kind of weird to say, especially if you're not somebody who keeps up with MMOs or plays all the latest MMOs. But there has been a trend in MMOs in probably even the past decade that a lot of MMOs come out, they're super on rails, and they don't really have that MMO feel, that community feel. New World definitely nails this in the sense of community with how good the crafting system is and wanting to trade or buy stuff from other crafters who have spent all the time maxing out one profession so they can craft you the highest tier stuff, to getting in companies to go do dungeons or more open world stuff with your companies, to getting in big groups with your faction to take over entire zones, to get buffs, to take over settlements, to have big wars with other factions, to have the big 50v50 instance wars to take or defend settlements. All of this stuff plays into the game, having a community, feeling much more like an MMO, and feeling like you need to be a part of the community and interact with other players to do what you want to do in the game. And I do think that voice over IP actually does help with that. I wasn't sure how I felt about an MMO having VoIP, but I haven't really had too many massively negative things that I've come across with that yet. And it has definitely helped with adding that sense of community, being able to just legitimately talk to people really easily. And I do think that sense of community and that massive feel is probably the strongest thing about New World right now. Now, the second strongest thing in my opinion is the crafting and gathering in New World. And I think this goes back to the roots of the game starting as a full loot survival-esque game with players building all the settlements and all the buildings and having a much more survival feel. Essentially, when New World was first shown off in the first alphas, it was just a MMO survival game, so think more like Ark, more like Rust, and much less a theme park MMO. And it seems that they have kept the crafting and gathering system from a game like that, where pretty much every tree, every bush, every plant, every rock is pretty much gatherable. And with all of these things being gatherable, you have a massive crafting system with tons of different professions to go along with that. And it is incredibly expansive. And I can definitely see myself and lots of other players spending a ton of time just trying to level up the gathering professions like harvesting up to the max level so you're able to gather everything of that specific profession, to get the more rare resources, to get the rare chance resources from all the different nodes, to then level up all your different crafting professions. And there's a ridiculous amount of time just to be put into those crafting systems, which also will allow you to get the equivalent of the best gear in the game, get better food, get better potions, weapon coatings, all this type of stuff, and it actually being useful. So I think those two things I just mentioned are going to be carrying the game a good amount of the way right now. And then one of the other really good things about the game is just how it looks, the graphical quality, and the overall aesthetics and feel of the game. The world just looks beautiful in any way you look at it. It's super immersive, has a really good graphics. Everything looks pretty good. The atmosphere is really good. When you go into some of the different zones, there's kind of fog that rolls over the zones. The shadows and lighting are all really good. That all comes together to just make a really immersive, atmospheric game. But with that, the optimization is not very good. That's pretty much all you can say about it. When you're alone or with just a couple other people, say out in the world, the performance is decent. Like out playing solo, I can get 70, maybe 80 FPS at 1440p at medium to high settings. But once you get in towns or big battles, the FPS just tanks. You're sitting at 30, 40 FPS in these big battles, or sitting in towns. Sometimes you'll even go lower than that. So it seems having a ton of people on screen absolutely tanks the performance. That's one of the weakest parts of the game right now, is the actual user side performance, but the servers have been pretty good overall to go along with that. And something else that I do think can be a very good part of New World is the statting and gearing. Now we haven't gotten to endgame and had full release to where metas start forming, but it seems like that's going to be a pretty good part of the game, because first off, you just have your attributes that you get every level, and then off gear, where getting to attribute thresholds will give you additional buffs. It's almost like having a attribute tier set bonuses. So once you get, I think it's 50, 100, so on, up to 5 different thresholds, that will give you some type of combat buff and some type of gathering or crafting buff. And that's really cool. So you can possibly mess around with hitting this certain attribute cutoff to get this buff, and then have a secondary cutoff that you want to get this specific buff from, because a lot of the weapons also do have primary and secondary attributes scaling on them. So there's definitely some areas you can play around with that. And then the gearing itself, you have your main stats on it, then you have gem slots on items that can have some pretty cool effects, such as like one of the main ones where it changes a portion of your damage to a element damage. So you can play around with that, where say if you're facing PvE on somebody, maybe they're a tank with a bunch of armor, but you have a bunch of gems to change a bunch of your damage to an element, which will help get past that armor or completely avoid that armor. Then you have the different perks that can be on all your different armor, where once you get to higher levels and higher rarities, you can have multiple perks on items that can do different things. Like one can cause, off every hit, will just cause a sort of chain lightning of different elemental damage, to just increasing crit damage, or even down to having higher chances to get rare items from gathering, so you can have different sets for gathering. And all of that combined seems like gearing is going to be pretty satisfying and have a lot of different variation in what people are actually using. And you're probably going to have experienced players have a ton of different sets for whatever they're trying to do at this specific moment, whether it be mob grinding and having all pieces that have perks that have a chance to give additional items from killing enemies, or all gathering pieces where you have an increased chance to get rare items from skinning or gathering, or PvP or PvE. And this brings me to one of the weakest parts of New World, in my opinion. And I do think this is probably going to be a more controversial opinion, because I don't really like the combat system overall. And it's not necessarily based on the weapons, because some of the weapons and some of the options you have in the weapon skill trees I do like the hatchet with Berserk and the other abilities in that tree. I do think feel really cool and decently fluid to play with. But the combat system overall, I think it needs a lot of changes. So first off, on the weapon side, with the abilities and perks you can get, I think they're really bland, and a lot of the hits and abilities in the game are you hit in this way and it does a little bit more damage, or you hit in this way or you do this flurry. And a lot of them just seem like very similar to basic attacks, or they're not really that interesting of abilities. I think they could have gone a lot more into making much more interesting abilities that fill different roles, do different things to switch up the gameplay, instead instead of feeling like you just did a flurry of basic attacks from pressing this ability. I do think they've gotten a little better with this, with the magic abilities, more specifically the Ice Gauntlet, and then some of the abilities with the Great Axe, which is one of the more new weapons, with having this vortex you can put on the ground, having a whirlwind that can pull in enemies, and some of these things. I think they're getting a little bit more unique and more creative with the abilities on their newer weapons, but I do think they have a lot of work to go with all of the abilities and choices in the weapon trees themselves. But I think the really bad part of the combat system is just how janky it feels a lot of the time, especially when you get to fighting against or with other players. Because first off, the ranged weapons have very bad hit registration. There's so many times where I'll shoot a range shot and it'll hit directly on an enemy, then like a second or half a second later it then does the damage, and I don't think that has to do with necessarily server performance. I think it has more to do with the hit registration in the game. Then you have you blatantly hitting an enemy, seeing an arrow, for example, in the enemy and it not getting a hit, to you hitting directly on something's head and not giving you a crit, to then sometimes you'll hit way above the head and it gives a crit. The hit registration on range weapons just seems to be very, very lacking in my opinion, and it doesn't feel near as smooth as the melee. But then once you get to melee fighting in a group with a bunch of players against a bunch of players, and it just starts to feel janky because you'll do abilities, it'll like rubber band you when doing an ability here because you're getting stuck on other players, so it just rubber bands you away, to it feeling super clunky when trying to hit enemies while other players are in melee range with them, so you're trying to like hit behind them and you're not getting hits, to it just trying to rubber band you to the side. And overall it just ends up feeling super janky once you get with a lot of other players. Even just against a bunch of PvE mobs, you'll start to see sometimes when you do abilities, you may just go straight through an enemy and not hit them, or they'll do an attack and you do an attack and in the game it physically hits but it doesn't actually count as a hit, and tons of stuff overall just makes the combat really janky and doesn't feel that great. And the last thing is just the overall content in the game. I do think New World is releasing pretty content light in my opinion, and I do think a lot of players are going to drop off in that first month. I think majority of the players that are left are going to be the people that want to farm up a bunch of different armor sets to do specific things and min-max that specific thing they're trying to do, or if they want to maximize their crafting profession or their gathering professions. And then the people that really like that faction v faction, company v company, taking over different settlements type of gameplay, I think those players are probably going to stay in the game for a lot longer. But I think a lot of the other players are going to drop off in the first month because the game is just overall content light in terms of unique quests. A lot of the quests are kind of the same things: kill this, gather that. There doesn't seem to be a ton of expeditions, which are dungeons in the game. There's nothing equivalent to raids or anything like that. I think the open world invasion style of gameplay will probably be getting old within that first month. So I do think Amazon is going to need to release content pretty quickly to be able to keep players playing for months and months. Now, they have said in the past that they want to add a content update every month, so legitimately new content on a monthly basis. If they're able to do that and add a substantial amount of content every month and keep smoothing out the combat and upping the performance, I think New World will have a pretty good chance to stay a pretty successful game. So that's pretty much all I want to go over with my thoughts on New World. Hopefully this video wasn't too unorganized. And like I said, I'm going to be posting a bunch of more videos on New World on my MMO channel. That'll be linked in the description in the pinned comment, so make sure to go check that out. So subscribe if you want to see more New World or other videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about New World, and thanks for watching.